So yes, so the talk is by Chris Erdman. He is currently the Assistant Director of Data Stewardship at the American Geophysical Union. Prior to this, he had a 4-year tenure at the ESO library, which he turned into one of the leading resources of its kind, thanks to his influence and expertise. And today he's here to tell us, to provide us a tutorial on the importance of citing and the improving of the discoverability. So thanks, Chris.
Yeah, and I wanted to actually say that also what Yell was saying in his last talk, these cookie cutters are something I'm very interested in, something that can make your lives easier as you're working in your research process. So yeah, I need to talk to you about that, because I think that would make our work easier too, on the AGU journal side as well. So, and there are automation solutions out there, I think, to Peter's comment. So, but yeah, I also wanted to speak about ESO just briefly, is that maybe some of you didn't know, and I think it's been mentioned a few times, is that in a way, Zenodo was born from ESO. So two of the people involved in sort of launching that initially, so Lars Holm Nielsen is at CERN now, and he was the lead developer at CERN leading that. And then also when I jumped across the pond and I worked at the Center for Astrophysics, we sort of, pushed Zenodo as a sort of community tool, made it, sort of easier for people to cite software. And of course, Arfon was involved there. So maybe we can make Arfon an honorary ESO member, along with maybe our ADS friends. But there's a history there with ESO. So maybe ESO can claim that as well. But I'm here to talk to you about software citation and discovery. This is just an overview of some of the things I'll talk about in the course of my talk tutorial. But I wanted to start with what are some of the software challenges that researchers are facing. And you don't have to go far. You can go to Twitter to see some of these challenges. So this reoccurring gripe from a researcher talking about how they have so many downloads of their software versus the DOI, the citation, which is sort of not reflecting the same sort of usage. So that's one challenge that you may hear. The other one is crediting the software. So in this particular respect, it was crediting the sort of underlying work that's been done on the software from teams. So some of the early career researchers that develop software for teams, credit is something that's sort of not easily sort of discovered when we're so paper-based. And the other thing, this is another challenge, finding software. It still remains a challenge. I think we mentioned ADS. There's that's definitely something that astronomy has that makes life better, but we could do better. Because finding software is still somewhat of a challenge based on sort of the directions that you go in search of software. So I was very happy to hear that, there's software code, but also another interesting thing to add is workflows. And we heard that from the first talk of the day. Models, anything related to your models, anything that's really integral to your research. This is what we would like to be shared, through at least the AGU journals. And we also are seeing that across the board. We saw that with the astronomy journals as well, AAS and monthly notices, and of course, ANA, EDP. So yeah, I think first of all, one of the things to think about, even at the very start, and it was great from the previous talk, Yale talked about data management plans. Actually, the NWO is working on a software management plan, but we have this previous example, and you can hear my dog drinking in the background. But a software management plan really helps you sort of organize your research project earlier on. It helps you sort of answer some of these, help you with answering these questions earlier on in your project. structuring everything. And I think this is something that a lot of groups sort of miss earlier on. And from my perspective, I definitely see this. I'm the data steward for AGU essentially. And so I see through all the papers that are being submitted, the challenges where people are sort of rushing at the end to think about these particular questions that would have been raised in a software management plan. And I think Yale also talked about this. So I wanted to pull out elements of maybe important points of that software management plan, but this is not comprehensive. So README was something that Yale said. And I think there's really no template for this out there. There is a readme.so, and I shared my slides, so I know I'm going to have a lot of links in here. So if you can access them in the Zoom chat, you can click on some things. But there really isn't like a template out there. This person developed a README template, and then they later were hired by GitHub. So I think GitHub will be incorporating some of this template work that had been done there. But Yale also talked about cookie cutters. This is something I'm very interested in from the AGU side of things, of providing a researcher early on with sort of a workable repository that has everything in it that sort of guides you through at various points through the project that helps you later on with sharing. And there are examples of cookie cutters. Yale said the data science cookie cutters are ones that people fork, they copy in GitHub and they reuse. There was one in the Pangeo community in the earth sciences, and it was done in the ocean sciences. And I was trying to encourage the researcher to develop that further so we could use it, or the Pangeo community, but there's really no funding for this, right? There's no encouragement. And so maybe Yale and you and I can talk about NWO supporting this, maybe. And Awesome List, there's this thing on GitHub. This applies to a lot of other things. So if you search in Google Awesome List GitHub, and READMEs, you'll find someone who's put together a list of lists of all these different sort of README type options that you can sort of reuse in your own work, or borrow. If you see something you like, you see that's really good, borrow, attribute to that group, of course, give them credit for reusing their template. But this goes a long way. And then there's sort of additional things that I think people sometimes also don't think about is how will others search for your software? The sort of search engine optimization, Google ranking that you can think about, and so like in a sense, like headings. What headings do you use? What language do you use? Like that's important. That will help you potentially in people sort of finding your work. And so, Greg, I really have been inspired by this one paper by Huka at Cal. I think this group is at Caltech, where they talk about how scientists search for software. And I learned a lot from that survey, but also Greg Wilson and the carpentries have been mentioned. So Greg Wilson was really fundamental to starting the carpentries, software and data carpentry. He also keeps his own bibliography. He reads often, research about software, and he has a lot of sort of good research that he lists on the bibliography. And some of them I pointed out here about, again, how to sort of categorize content in GitHub README files. And then there's this 10 quick tips for making things findable, which Greg was involved with actually. But to add to that, so the carpentries is really great. I used to work for them, so I am an instructor. I taught various workshops, many, and I think like one of the things that I wish I had the opportunity to do was really work with teams. I remember hearing from a lot of people that went to carpentries training where they went as the lone researcher, the lone person from their lab. And they would go back and say, I learned all these great things, how can we do this? And the rest of the lab was not on the same page because they didn't have the same experience. So this is something that started up in the US called Openscapes, and it really pivots off of it builds off of work that Julia Stewart Lowndes has done in the sort of ocean sciences, where they have a really great paper called Our Path to Better Science. And what they talk about really in that paper is how they, as a team, the Ocean Health Index, learned all sort of these skills from the carpentries about how to work more efficiently, how to sort of share their data, their research more efficiently as well. And they're taking that work and they're building it into Openscapes, which now NASA and NOAA are all doing. So the DACs, the data centers in NASA, are all taking this program, Openscapes, and they're taking it as teams. They're taking it as a cohort. So all these sort of project management skills, all these sort of open science skills, they're learning together. So this is like carpentries plus, like I think this is something that would be great to see at ESO, if we could do this with teams. The other thing you would find in that software management plan is licenses. This is sort of often forgotten and it's so critical, for reducing the friction later on about how people can reuse your work. And a lot of people sort of talk about this as the next cliff, like, because it's sort of people are not paying attention to licensing their work. And it can create problems later on, as far as legal problems, but also people reusing your work, just not including a license could be problematic. So there is a tool. There's this choose an open source license tool that's really handy, and I encourage you to go to that. But there's also a resource that the Software Sustainability Institute put out. It's a little bit dated. I realized it's from 2015, but I know that they will release some more information. They already have a number of resources on their website that you find useful, Software Sustainability Institute. But this is about sort of the questions around licensing your software. But I know when I was in astronomy, AstroBetter was also a resource. And I remember Jake Vanderplas had a really great a post on the questions around licensing your software. So the other thing is, like, think about it early on, choose your repository. And I know astronomy, and we hear this in the Earth and space sciences too, is that I don't have to do really this work because the archives do it for me. I can just point to the archives. Well, there's additional work that you have to share beyond that. I mean, I think that's why Zenodo is so popular, because there's sort of additional derived data that you want to share. There's sort of additional software, other things that you want to share. So, the data centers can help you to a certain extent, but there's this additional aspect of, well, I need to choose, I need to think about these repositories early on and think about how my work will be represented in that repository. That will help you later on, like when you're sharing, is thinking about how you structure things early on, like in your project, and how it will, be shared later on. And really the typical thing that we say here is we try to encourage researchers to work with a domain repository, because the domain repository is supposed to know your data and your software the best, and have sort of the metadata and other things there that align with your community. And then there's the institutional side, which sometimes you encounter, of course, which you're at a university and they sort of want you to deposit in their own repository as well. But I think what resonated when we were working on Zenodo was that we wanted to think sort of community-wide. And so Zenodo has become very popular because taking that sort of mindset, we thought integrating it into ADS would be really important. And it did really take off in astronomy. And in a way, astronomy led the way, encouraged other communities to start doing this as well. So that was a really good example. But the reason why you would want to do that is that, when GitHub was mentioned earlier, it's a great development platform, but it isn't a long-term preservation solution. You can lose your stuff. You can move it. Someone can delete it. I have actually seen it in my capacity as a data steward. These kind of instances where people will actually delete a repository after sharing it, via our paper. So this is something we really stress at our journal, at our journals. And so I think this has probably been mentioned already, but there is this resource called Making Your Code Citable. I think it's changed, but it's still there at GitHub. This guide sort of walking you through this process of releasing your code from your repository, so GitHub, to Zenodo, and getting sort of that DOI for citation. And the thing I want to point out here is that people sort of often also overlook this other aspect, which is your author name comes in very funky sometimes. If you don't pay attention to it, it will look as if it's your GitHub account, and that's not necessarily helpful. And then also your title can come through a certain way as well, which you probably will also want to enhance and maybe add a little context, because in some ways, if you have sort of an acronym or something for your software that doesn't necessarily make sense right away, then having a little bit of context there would help. Like, what does the software do? And then versions are, the sort of versioning side of things is also important. So Zenodo provides that to you, so you can sort of cite particular versions related to the work that you're sort of publishing. A little known useful tool is sandbox.zenodo.org. I've actually worked with a number of researchers that have sort of felt apprehensive about sharing their code, and when I show them that there's actually a place where they can test all this and see how it works, then they feel a little bit more confident, and they appreciate the fact that there's this way to sort of test things out that's not going to be permanent. The DOI is a little bit scary. It's for you can request at the end of the day, request Zenodo to remove something, but a DOI seems very permanent, right? And it is. It's supposed to be permanent, there for a while at least. I won't say forever, but for as long as CERN exists. And so sandbox.zenodo.org is where you can sort of test these things out, and it's a really useful tool. And I really one of the reasons why I also mentioned sandbox .zenodo.org is that there is this thing that I think authors often miss, which is the related identifiers, how you link your software to other work that you're doing. So it's your paper, but it can also be, to sort of other aspects, like mention the workflows and mention data, so you can sort of link all this stuff together that helps improve discoverability at the end of the day, because these links ultimately will make it into the scholarly ecosystem, and be represented, and so people can sort of click and follow certain things. But most of the times authors just want to get things done, and I don't blame you. Take your vacation you put in a paper, you take your vacation for a week or two, you don't want to go back and create these links. But it really is important to link up all your research. So the other thing that was mentioned earlier too is this availability statement. This is something actually we're kind of working against now. It's been available through journals for a while, to sort of as a place for you to share all your sort of data, your software. The trouble with that, the availability sections in journals, is that it's not machine readable. The fact that if you get a DOI for your data and you link to it in your availability statement, the credit aspect that we talked about earlier, it's problematic. It won't be counted. It has to be cited. It has to be in the references. And this is a part that I think we've had to sort of work with our community to teach, is that, you know, it's not enough to link to it in your availability statement. You really need to cite it as well. That's what really it helps with all this other discoverability stuff and credit. You know, the availability statement is where you sort of provide additional context about the particular things you're sharing. So it is useful. Like, it gives sort of, it's sort of like a guide to people reading your paper of like what can they expect to find there? What can they you know, what can they expect to find here and there? For software, we recommend that you share all these sort of things as you're writing your statement. And so you can see, you know, version, the license I mentioned earlier, access conditions, the in-text citation, the reference part is really critical here. But we also have this template. I think that's been mentioned before. And, you know, really having the sort of workable solution, the one that's on the GitHub repository or another repository you're using, and then the preserved version, which, you know, will be around for a while longer. The GitHub version could change, but, you know, I think the authors can sort of pivot to what's being done in that repository now versus what was frozen, you know, with relation to the research. So these are examples of software citations. You know, I think there's a lot of Zenodo in here. But the thing I wanted to highlight with these is you can already see that, you know, this example where the title could have maybe been improved for the second bullet, you know, where you could have had sort of additional context, and maybe the first one could have used some author information, although I think they're calling themselves just the lab for exosphere and blah blah blah. But the really important part here is the bracketed description, and this surprises people. This is something we're stressing, and this will be part of recommended guidance for every journal. So AAS journals, ANA, you know, this recommendation is coming out of Force 11. You know, it's a group of various people, stakeholders across the system. So the reason why we're sort of recommending the bracketed description is that your paper kind of goes through all these different steps along the journey, and in some ways there are people involved, and they don't. Some of the automated routines and other things and people don't necessarily know that that's software, don't necessarily know that that's data. And from what we've been finding as we've been testing this process out is that data and software citations get stripped out of the citations at the end of the day, because if a publisher submits your paper and these references to the main indexing service, so this is Crossref for all the other journals, that system sort of requires you to have certain things. And if you have sort of a DOI that's from another place, then it sort of throws an error. And then it gets, you know, the publishers don't want that to happen. They'll strip it out, and they want their papers to be submitted. So we had a huge problem there. Is that it was being stripped out. And then another aspect of this is that the credit aspect, the event data for these things was also, there was a problem with the scripting between different services. So Crossref and DataCite. So AGU have been working with a lot of partners to make this work correctly for everyone. And so the software bracketed description tells publishers to tag this a certain way so that it doesn't trip that system, and that you can get that credit, you can get that those citations with it. And so it becomes a really important thing. And I know it seems very simple, but that's where we came around to it as we were testing the system. I just wanted to provide an example here of just a piece of a statement that we created recently. And I think it's a really good example. It comes from this Koymans et al. Group. I think they are in the Netherlands again. And we worked through sort of what an availability statement should look like, but also worked with them on doing their citations in this new format. And the reason why this is a really good example is that the question of, can I cite the software paper and the actual preserved version of it in Zenodo? Yes, you should cite both, and that's the example here of the Wessel et al. That actually ends up, that generic mapping tools software is like the third most popular paper in AGU journals. Software papers are very popular. So that was a really good example, and also sort of listing the version, the licensing information, some additional information to help readers. You don't want to parachute them in to your research. You really want to provide them with all this sort of information that helps them sort of find things faster. And that's one of the problems that we're fighting against too, is that we still have examples of people saying, I can go, my data, it can be found at this archive, and they'll provide a general web link, or my software can be found at this general web link. And that puts a lot of onus on the reader to try and find that particular data or that software without some additional contextual information to help guide them, or a direct link. And then also, it doesn't help them with citing it as well. So that's a major problem as well. So yeah, this paper was a really good example of sort of walking through this with an author, and I remember they said it was very enlightening too, just seeing why these things are important. And so the other thing I wanted to mention here is we've mentioned GitHub, and there's actually a new tool out there called the citation file format, the citation file format tool. And if what this does is, you can go to this website and you can create a .cff file, and you can put that in your GitHub repository, and that signals to GitHub to use that as your citation for that repository. And that's really great. That's because we see this example come up all the time in AGU, is that people want to cite software from various locations. So they may not know about your Zenodo deposit. They may not know about your paper on software. And so, like, if somehow someone uses your software and they use the GitHub link, and there's no citation there, then that will be causing sort of a problem, a challenge for just really citing the software the way you want it to be cited. So that's a great tool, but that's really a good point to say that you have software in various locations. I think this is a wider challenge of how do you sort of aggregate, how do you represent your work, and how do you sort of tie it together? Because it could be in different places. And so representing it in all these different places is really, critical. So this has really been taking off. I haven't looked at it since, but at the time, I think this was December, there were already 4,235 CFF files. So it's most likely much, much more now. And I wanted to sort of come back to, one point I wanted to make is that we don't have really a data availability statement anymore. We have an availability statement, because it's not just data. It's not just that you have to share. You also have to share your software, and you should share other things too that are important to understanding your research. So in reality, it's availability statement. It should be that you're sharing all this other stuff that could help others sort of trying to understand your research. And so in that process of sort of opening this up to software too, so not just having a data policy, not just having data availability statements, we worked with our editors to sort of understand additional questions, which is, do you really need to do all this work if really software is sort of one line in an equation or something like our lines of an equation? And those are sort of the things that we're working through right now to sort of clarify. This is our second iteration of the guidance that's coming through based on all this sort of feedback from our community about how we can sort of make it more straightforward for people. So at the end of the day, benefits of citing your software, you get a persistent copy. It cannot be confused with other versions or copies. You sort of improve your discoverability, awareness of your work, and it's trackable. You get credit for this as well. But wait, there's more. I don't know if anyone has stayed up late at night. There's these commercials on TV, and they always have that tagline, but wait, there's more. So I really also want you to think about, software search and discovery, like, because I think this is a part where sometimes we don't take a step back and think about, how do others find our work? How do they, and it's interesting, if you go out there and look at how, discovery works, it still needs some help. So I mentioned some other things, like I mentioned some things already, like GitHub in the talk. I didn't mention NASA ADIS, but I'll mention it again. There's another place, PyPy and sort of CRAN places with your R packages. This is where you also share your software. And I've seen people sort of cite or reference software from these places as well. And I've seen that authors will have different information about how to cite their software versus another location. So again, like, where is your software? Where is it in different locations? And try to have sort of a harmonizing approach of how you cite this. Google search your software as well. I want to sort of also touch on some of these other points. So organization, registry, dependency was mentioned. The journal aspect, friend, colleague. This really is just, typically what also happens is you go to the next cube or you go to the next office and ask someone what software they're using. So, capturing that sometimes that is a little bit more difficult. But I wanted to mention a tool that I think was very useful, and for sort of me understanding, I wanted to get an understanding what was happening at ESO as far as software related sharing. And one helpful resource is the Telescope Bibliography. I'm a little bit biased because I worked on this with Uta and developing this Telescope Bibliography. And it's a great resource as far as tapping into what ESO is doing as far as its research. And this demonstrates the process of sort of mining through the literature and making all these sort of connections, that curation aspect of tying all these things together. That's what TelBib helps you do. And the benefit of that is I could go to ADS and there is a bib group. And so Uta actually, and the ESO library shares that information with ADS. So I can go and search the bib group ESO telescopes, and I see ESO is pretty prolific, 18,000+ papers. But I went back, as far as like, okay, well, when one of the sort of key indicators as far as like software sharing, I could probably go back further, but I just decided I'm going to use GitHub as sort of a link, because a lot of the sharing has not necessarily been standardized yet. Like, people have been doing it in different ways, but you can ensure that a lot of people have been sharing via GitHub. And so you can actually search for that through as a keyword in the full text. So this full is full text. And I found that, going back a certain time frame, it's 6% I also, if you look at, so, okay, be fair. We just started doing this recently. Let's just say, started improving this, then it does increase. It's 10%. If you go to look at what, how many of these sort of have Zenodo links, then you really get a small amount. And then ASCL had 14 as well, which is a great resource I'll mention soon here as well. But, I think this, and I just wanted to mention too, if you wanted to sort of compare this to across AGU journals, it's not necessarily better. We have 27% of our papers have some mention of software availability, and it's all across the board, with regards to how they're sharing, and that this is what we're working with researchers on, sort of improving this process with all the sort of information that I provided earlier. But you do have journals like James, which is for modeling, which makes sense that software is really important to them. And you can see the rate is dramatically improved versus Oceans, which is still very low. And then, the remainder of this is like the remainder of that sort of percentage in availability statements is all focused towards data. So we started early on just saying, provide just the data, and our papers coming through are still sort of stuck on just sharing that information. So we're working through that aspect as well. So you can see sort of in comparison, maybe. And this is another project that I was working on at the Center for Astrophysics before I left, which is called Exclesias, which sounds like an organ in your body. I really wish we had chosen a different name for it. But it just concluded, and this was between Zenodo and or CERN, Zenodo, and ADS and AAS. And I think some other groups in our GitHub, I think, was involved. But they really looked at all these sort of links, again, that all those representations of software in various places, and tried to sort of reconcile them, so that you could sort of have this aggregated way of discovering things. And it concluded it really needs a lot more resources. This work takes a lot of resources of work to curate this kind of information. So I guess this is one thing where I get to registries, and I think there's some really good examples. So Yale was in the Netherlands, and they have this research software directory. It's actually open source, and what that does is they can actually track software at sort of this Uber level of what software is being used in the community, and they can tie all these links together. And it's just a great example, and it's open source, and you can reuse it. There's another more lightweight version, which is from the Imperial College London, still in beta. I think it will always be in beta, but it taps into GitHub, and I think they sort of tap into a keyword or something that you use in your repository, so the organization can know about it, and they create this sort of directory that you can reference. And I think they do this sort of linking to other resources like Zenodo through that as well. There is this other thing that came through recently, Citing, from Vanessa Sochat, and she's in the research software engineering community. If you haven't heard about the research software engineers and you care about software, you should check it out, because it's a great group trying to really move forward, push forward sort of credit for this kind of work in academia, the software work, and also organizations too. But Vanessa is part of that community, and she had a question, which I think we also started off with, which is looking beyond the paper, and really looking at the software that's used and all the dependencies underlying it, where they don't get the credit. They don't get the credit of that sort of software reusing it. We're sort of at that first level, and her work really sort of identifies the fact that, hey, look, there's sort of this underlying dependency stuff that we should really care about as well. And I think that we really should grow her work further. The Citing tool seems really promising as far as, really giving credit to those dependencies. Sorry, and I went to one of these registries. But a really important one for astronomy is, and I don't want to steal her thunder. I think Alice Allen would be talking about this later, but the astrophysics source code library is a really great tool, a great resource for astronomers as well, for the astronomy community, where it also does that linking between all these sort of different resources that are out there. It tries to create that sort of aggregated view that astronomers can sort of tap into and cite reference. And it could be another place where sort of ESO works collaboratively with the ASCL and already something that's there for the astronomy community to really track this for ESO, like to demonstrate the additional stuff that the community is doing, particularly with software. So not being so paper-based, right? I really wanted to also, I think I wanted to pivot from that and mention something else. We did, I don't have to go into it, thankfully, but FAIR was mentioned earlier. In case you forget what that is, it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Really what it boils down to is making your research work more machine readable. So all these sort of machines across the internet can interact with each other and be interoperable and share this information. And you got a sort of a glimpse of that when I talked about citations and how we want to make that more discoverable and improve credit. But I wanted to emphasize that people have worked on thinking about FAIR for software. And it's a great resource to sort of tap into this FAIR principles for research software and think about, look at how they've sort of thought about machine readable, how they thought about FAIR. And just to give you an example, there's probably some common things you already heard, which is provide a persistent identifier, provide a DOI, right, for your software. Those are things that they to sort of discuss in that work. But I think, in some ways that takes a certain approach, but it doesn't necessarily look at, again, the sort of discoverability aspect and how people find your software. And so in AGU journals, I've done analysis of the software sharing. And the really interesting thing is the citations for Zenodo preserved versions of software in Zenodo really you only see like one citation each, one or two, which leads me to believe that Zenodo is more for documentation. It's more for that preservation aspect. It's not exactly, like if you really cared about your software being cited, that you wanted to be cited, then I think that what speaks to discoverability a bit more, is really that paper aspect again. And I think Chris Lynn talked about it, that the AAS sort of supports papers, and he talked about a journal of open source software. When I look at software shared in our journals, the thing that gets cited the most are actually papers, and then again, particularly the Journal of Open Source Software. These get citations, and these are where groups really care about their software and want it to be discoverable, and they want it to be cited. You really do see the value of it in sort of the work that we're doing now. And so I wanted to sort of mention that, is that there's sort of this interesting thing going on here, is that you do want to document your stuff and you do want to preserve it in Zenodo. But if you really, this other aspect is sort of producing a paper, producing, this journal of open source software record, citation is another way to go as well. I also wanted to mention too, and it came up earlier, badging. And I've been adding to my presentation as I've been listening on to all these great talks. Is that I think we're at a point now, and Chris, I think, alluded to this, is that Chris Lintott, is that we can maybe start sort of making these things actionable. So we talked about reproducibility, we talked about, sort of these aspects of it. And I think like now, what I hear with research from other researchers in our community is that they would really like to filter things, filter and say, show me all the papers that really only have software, that have data. I really don't want to mess with these other, I don't want to read these other papers that don't share this information, and get bogged down into potentially finding an availability statement that says data available upon request, or software is available, like at this location, and it leads to a dead end. So like, I think we're really at a point where we can actually start seeing the value. And I think that that's been what's been difficult, is that we haven't necessarily seen the value throughout the system of doing some of this work. And I think, really people will start seeing the value. Like, I will not, my work will not be findable. It won't be found if I don't do this, like people will start searching in this way. So I think this will be really important. I think it speaks again to that bracketed description thing that I was talking about in the citations. If you go to the ADS, the sharing that's happening right now, they are mining the links to all these repositories, but the type of it, the type associated with those links is not necessarily collected. It's not displayed in the ADS. It's not filterable. So if you go to the ADS, you'll see a data filter. If you're interested in software, that could be problematic. But for instance, you could search by ASCL, and you could filter that way if that's where maybe more of the software is. Or I know that a lot of people sort of publish through Zenodo, but that's not perfect. Like that I think another thing is we have to think about, the sort of the typing that's going on here, and think about how we can sort of help ourselves with discoverability. And so I think that's what we're trying to work towards in the AGU too, is really, and you have this example actually from PLOS about how they're maybe starting to implement the data badge, but I think that the next phase is making this more actionable. And the last thing I think this is the last thing. I did add slides as we were talking, but I did want to say we are really excited about notebook science. And we think that this will really change how we do research, and really speak to some of the challenges that we're talking about. So we're putting together a group that's going to look at how do we create sort of a new format, not a notebooks journal, but a notebooks way of publishing. And that really is tied into the research process, and capturing all the things that we talked about. So you don't have to worry about it. It's in your workflows. And so we are putting together a stakeholder group to really to look at this and share this information openly. I believe the AAS is involved in that, Chris, if your ears are burning right now, if you're still on the call. Yeah, we started with this this notebook sort of guidance on citing notebooks, because we had interest in our community about giving credit to the notebook work that people were doing. It's still not like it's still sort of minimal about how many notebooks are shared, but it is increasing in importance. People want to share them, and so we felt this pressure of putting out this guidance. No one had it. I think no one in the publisher community wanted to take it on because they didn't know how to handle it. And we did it. We put our best foot forward and said, let's produce some guidance. Let's put some steps together about how we can help people cite their notebooks. And again, this speaks to the fact that they can put it in an availability statement, not just a data availability statement. So you can share sort of other research objects alongside your paper. So I think this is the last slide, which is one of the other things I want to advocate for is that you advocate and you drive policies in your community. And it sounds like we already had cases of that, but I'm just sharing the data policy for AGU, which comes from our community, which has really driven the work that we've done, in our work. So thank you. That was a lot of information, probably the fire hose, but here for your questions.
Thanks very much, Chris. So yes, there has been a lot of feedback on Slack. There is one question and many comments. So I'm going to read the question first. Ushin Krainer had a question, which I think some of it has been answered by the talk. It was about how researchers can give and receive appropriate credit. He also adds that citation counts and H-index do not seem to strongly favor being a minor member of a huge team, producing many separate output over projects where one person has done a lot of work over many years, but produced not as much output. So for such situations, what do you think?
Well, I mean, that's part of my what I work through is that sort of we're working on different aspects of this right now, right? That all this sort of information was sharing was looking at how we can sort of look at reevaluate how credit is done. And I mentioned that I'm on I think previously on the Slack on the Dora Terra project, which will look at software. I think, look at sort of how we can give credit, but I think that maybe another aspect that I didn't talk about is that there's a long, hard road of sort of institutionalizing these things, like of working with your community. And I think at the end, I was talking about that sort of the policy side of really working, taking sort of these things that you can do, making sense of it, what it means to you to give credit, and developing a policy, developing sort of this guidance to really, to really drive things. So I don't know. It's also sort of my answer is coupled with I don't know. We're focused on citation, but I know there are other things we can do. And I mentioned them in the talk. And the best we can do is work towards improving things. Work towards giving credit where we can.
Okay, thank you. I see one other question here. Toby Brown asks, have you considered using software containers for publishing notebooks like in Bibliography?
Yeah, that makes it into our guidance. So our Jupyter guidance, actually, that I shared at the end. It's interesting because that was one of the first things I was tasked with when I joined AGU, is like, think about how we can share containers. And then I think it went to, well, it's simpler to think about notebooks, at least to start. And let's focus on this. But I think we are moving into that sort of frame now, where it's how do you sort of share that computational environment. A lot of things, a lot of us are moving to cloud computing, and it'll be interesting how things shift in that sense, like of how we represent things there. And that's why I think we're so excited about notebooks. And I know people have been talking about this for a while. That's why we call the project Notebooks Now with an exclamation mark. But we feel like that notebooks will be really critical in that space, like for sort of tapping into all those resources and capturing the provenance, capturing all these things, like all this work that all these resources that you're working on, and then sort of capturing that for later for sharing and publishing. So yeah, pretty excited about that. And that does tie into some of the stuff that's coming out of NASA TOPS and the NASA Open Science stuff and ourselves, because 2023 is going to be a big year open science at AGU as well. So
excellent, thank you. There are a lot, so your talk has received a lot of positive feedback here. People are excited about the citation format file and also Citeline as well. So please take a look at the comments when you can.